Welcome. Today we are looking at Paul's arrest, trial, and journey to Rome. This is a key topic in your CRS exams for SS3. Pay close attention. Let us begin. First, let me explain the events leading to Paul's arrest. Paul was determined to go to Jerusalem. He knew that prison and hardships awaited him, but he was compelled by the Spirit. He traveled to Jerusalem and was welcomed by the believers. He reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. The elders of the Jerusalem church were concerned. Many Jews had believed in Jesus, and they were zealous for the law. They had heard a rumor that Paul was teaching Jews living among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses. They were told that Paul said not to circumcise children or follow Jewish customs. The elders suggested a plan to prove that Paul was living in obedience to the law. Paul was to join 4 men who had taken a vow and pay their expenses. This would show that he was not against the law. Paul agreed. He went to the temple to give notice of the completion of the purification days. Now let us turn to Paul's arrest in the temple. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him. They shouted, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. Besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul. They assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused. The people came running from all directions. They dragged Paul out of the temple, and the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops. He heard that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander arrested Paul and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He asked who Paul was and what he had done, but the crowd was shouting different things. The commander could not get at the truth. He ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. Paul asked the commander for permission to speak to the crowd. The commander gave permission. Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When all was silent, he spoke to them in Aramaic. He described his early life as a Pharisee and his persecution of the church. He told them about his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. He described his conversion and his call to preach to the Gentiles. The crowd listened until he said the word Gentiles. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him! He's not fit to live." They threw off their cloaks and flung dust into the air. The commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that Paul be flogged and interrogated to find out why the people were shouting at him. Let me now walk you through Paul's trial before the Sanhedrin. As they were stretching Paul out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" The centurion reported this to the commander. The commander came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" Paul said, "Yes." The commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander was alarmed. He realized that he had put a Roman citizen in chains. The next day, the commander wanted to know the real reason why Paul was accused. He ordered the chief priests and the entire Sanhedrin to assemble. He brought Paul and had him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." The high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Paul said, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those standing near Paul said, "You dare to insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Paul then saw that the Sanhedrin was divided between Pharisees and Sadducees. He called out, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, A dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits. But the Pharisees believe all these things. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces. He ordered the troops to take Paul away by force and bring him into the barracks. What about the plot to kill Paul? The next morning, more than 40 Jews formed a conspiracy. They bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. They went to the chief priests and the elders. They said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now petition the commander to bring him before you. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But Paul's nephew heard of this plot. He went into the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." The centurion took him to the commander. The young man reported the plot. The commander dismissed him and told him not to tell anyone that he had reported this information. Let me now discuss Paul's transfer to Caesarea. The commander called 2 of his centurions. He ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul, so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He also wrote a letter to the governor. The letter said, "This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. I came with my troops and rescued him. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law. There was no charge worthy of death or imprisonment. I was informed of a plot to kill him. I sent him to you." The soldiers carried out their orders. They brought Paul to Caesarea and presented him to the governor. Felix ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Now let me walk you through Paul's trials before Felix, Festus, and Agrippa. Paul was kept in prison for 2 years. Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. Festus went to Jerusalem. The chief priests and Jewish leaders brought charges against Paul. They requested that Festus bring Paul to Jerusalem, planning to kill him along the way. Festus refused. He told them to come to Caesarea. At the trial, the Jews brought many serious charges, but could not prove them. Paul defended himself, saying, "I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law, or against the temple, or against Caesar." Festus wanted to do the Jews a favor. He asked Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there?" Paul answered, "I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong. If I am guilty of anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." After conferring with his council, Festus declared, "You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go." Some days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Festus discussed Paul's case with him. Agrippa said he would like to hear Paul himself. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp. Festus ordered that Paul be brought in. Paul gave his defense before Agrippa. He told his conversion story again. He said, "I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer, and, as the first to rise from the dead, would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles." Festus interrupted, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane." Paul replied, "I am not insane. What I am saying is true and reasonable." "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets?" "I know you do." Agrippa said, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul answered, "Short time or long, I pray to God, that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." Let me now discuss Paul's journey to Rome. Paul and other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius. They boarded a ship from Adramyttium. They sailed along the coast of Asia. The next day, they landed at Sidon. Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive care. From there, they sailed to Myra in Lycia. The centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put them on board. They sailed slowly for many days. Sailing had become dangerous because the Day of Atonement was already past. Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion listened to the pilot and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. What happened during the storm? When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. They weighed anchor and sailed. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down. The ship was caught by the storm. They could not head into the wind. They gave way to it and were driven along. On the 14th night, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that they would run aground, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Paul encouraged the men. He said, "Keep up your courage, men. I have faith in God that it will happen just as He told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." On the 14th night, the sailors tried to escape. They lowered the lifeboat. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. He said, "Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." He took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. When daylight came, they saw a bay with a sandy beach. They decided to run the ship aground. The ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move. The stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, afraid that some would swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life. He kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. Everyone reached land safely. What happened on the island of Malta? Once safely on shore, they found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed them unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed them all. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood and put it on the fire. A viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. The islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand. They said to each other, "This man must be a murderer. He escaped from the sea, yet justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. After waiting for a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby owned by Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed them and entertained them hospitably for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him. He prayed and placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. The islanders honored them in many ways. When they were ready to sail, they put on board the supplies they needed. After 3 months, they sailed for Rome. They arrived at Puteoli and found brothers and sisters there. They were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And so they came to Rome. The believers from Rome came out to meet them. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and was encouraged. He was allowed to live by himself, with a soldier to guard him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. That's all for this topic. See you in the next topic.